Welcome back, everyone. Binary Tech Labs here, and today's lab is actually a request. I will be demonstrating how to install Home Assistant on an x86 based laptop, which are typically either Intel or AMD, and since Raspberry Pis are so hard to get a hold of right now, this setup can make good use of some older and easier to find devices. Timestamps are below if you want to jump straight into a certain part of the process, but we will go over the hardware prerequisites, BIOS settings, bootable media device options, creating a bootable live OS on USB, writing the Home Assistant OS to the laptop, and first boot configuration. If this is what you're here for, let's go. The system you pick must be 64-bit capable and UEFI bootable. UEFI boot mode is supported by nearly all computers manufactured in the previous 10 years. Probably heard the acronyms BIOS and UEFI before, and you're probably familiar with what they stand for: Basic Input-Output System and Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, respectively. Well, maybe not the latter. Either way, BIOS is saved on EEPROM, which is Erasable Programmable Read-Only Memory, whereas UEFI is stored in a EFI file, which is kept on a specific partition on the hard drive called the EFI System Partition, or ESP for short. UEFI was created to address many of the constraints of the original BIOS architecture, which operates in 16-bit mode, whereas UEFI can operate in 64-bit mode. So the laptop I will be using is an Asus VaioBook with an AMD A9-9425 processor with 2 CPUs running at 3.1 GHz with 8 gigs of RAM, and it also has 2 USB 2.0 and 1 USB 3.0 ports and a 1 terabyte hard drive. To get Home Assistant to boot properly, we must first set our BIOS to allow UEFI boot and deactivate secure booting. You can see how I complete these BIOS modifications on this laptop, but regrettably, this step is highly dependent on the hardware you are using, so this section may be different for you. But remember that Google is your friend here. Simply Google your device name and UEFI boot if you're having any troubles. I also do apologize for the recording. I have no way of capturing the video without doing it this way. So now that we have our BIOS settings all configured properly, the next step is to move on to our media options and how we're going to go about getting Home Assistant onto our drive. A SATA hard drive, SATA SSD, M.2 SSD, or eMMC is commonly used as the boot media on laptops. External media such as a USB SSD could also be used to boot the Home Assistant operating system. However, this is not recommended. We must write the Home Assistant operating system to our target boot media since it does not have an integrated installer, which means that the operating system must be installed on the boot media for our first boot. So we have two options for completing the installation. The first option is to transfer the OS image directly to the media device, as you would a micro SD card. However, this would require us to remove the media device from the laptop. The second option is to boot a live operating system like Ubuntu on USB, and then image the laptop's media device with the Home Assistant operating system from that environment. And as I mentioned, since the first option requires us to take our boot media out of the laptop, I'm going to use option 2. Because I currently use Ubuntu, making a bootable USB will be quite straightforward, but I've included links to guidelines for other operating systems that you may use to construct a bootable Ubuntu USB flash drive. To do this, we will also need a 4 GB or bigger USB flash drive and a Ubuntu ISO file, which can be downloaded from the URL provided below. So I've gone ahead and already downloaded that ISO image. So the first thing we're going to want to do in order to install Ubuntu to my USB flash drive is we're going to bring up the program called Startup Disk Creator. Here we will select the image, which is Ubuntu 20.04. And here we will select the device on which we want to write to. Just be careful you do select the right device, otherwise you will erase something that you might not possibly want to erase. So once we've selected those two things, we just go ahead and click on Make Startup Disk. It will give you a warning telling you that it will erase everything. So as we can see, The Startup Disk Creator is similar to other imaging software we've used, such as Balena Etcher or Raspberry Pi Imager. These applications all function the same way. You choose your image, then the disk you want to write it to, and then you perform the flash, write, burn, whatever the flavor they've termed it. And in the end, your image is now written on the device of your choice. And we have a bootable USB drive with a live Ubuntu OS installed. I will just go ahead and speed this up so you don't have to watch this create the startup disk, and I will bring the video back when it completes. All right, it's complete. So with our BIOS configuration completed and our bootable USB drive with Ubuntu on it, we can now move over to writing Home Assistant onto the laptop. For that, we are going to need a couple of things. One is the Home Assistant OS release for the generic x86 image, which I have downloaded, and we will also need Balena Etcher installed. So what I went ahead and did is grabbed the Ubuntu app image version of Balena Etcher so that I can run Balena Etcher from the USB drive that we just created. And the USB drive that we are using, or that I am using, is a 16 gigabyte, so I am able to store the Balena Etcher software as well as the Home Assistant software, the Home Assistant image, onto the USB drive. So I only require the one USB drive to do this. This step is important, and I forgot to mention it. When Ubuntu starts up, skip the install wizard that appears. It'll ask you if you're sure you want to quit. Just click yes. When you do confirm that you want to quit the wizard, it'll take you to the desktop. Otherwise, it will try to install Ubuntu on the drive that we want to put Home Assistant on, which is not what we want. As it turns out, I did need to use another USB drive to load in Balena Etcher and the Home Assistant OS image. So my 16 gigabyte flash drive was unnecessary, and all you really need is a 4 gigabyte one for the Ubuntu image. And for the additional drive that I used to transfer Balena Etcher and the Home Assistant image, I used an overkill 64 gigabyte one, but it only needs to be another 4 gigabyte one. The next step is to launch Disk Manager and delete all the partitions on your primary drive in order to prepare it for the Home Assistant installation. I kept my Windows recovery partition untouched so that I could reinstall my Windows system after this lab. So, after all the partitions have been erased, we must create a new one. With the type set to Other. We'll select No File System as the file system and then press the Create button. Then we'll copy Balena Etcher and the Home Assistant image to the Downloads folder. It doesn't have to be that one. Any folder would do, but that's the one I used. Finally, we can right-click the Balena Etcher app image and choose Properties, then go over to the Permissions tab and select Allow Executing File as Program. Now we can double-click Balena Etcher and select our Home Assistant image. Then we select the drive to install it to, and since it's a system drive, we need to click the Show One Hidden and then select our drive. It'll give us a few warnings about writing to a system drive, but that's fine. This is what we want. Simply press the flash button, and after it is finished, we may shut down the laptop and unhook any USB drives before restarting it. Again, I really do apologize for having to record a screen instead of being able to capture it, but it is what it is, I guess. So Home Assistant is now booting up for the first time on the laptop, as you can see here. So once it is booted up, we'll be able to go over to the web page that it provides. And I just noticed that the network failed. I forgot to plug that cable in. So I'll just plug that network cable in and restart Home Assistant. And once it is up and running, you will see the video back on the desktop. Sorry about that. Okay, I plugged my cord into my RJ45 adapter, which I had forgotten about, and restarted the laptop. Let's go over to the Home Assistant instance to make sure it is up and running. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I don't have my MDNS support, so I'll use the laptop's IP address and port 8123. At this point, what we are seeing is Home Assistant preparing to set up. This process can take up to 20 minutes, like it said. Usually it is a little bit faster than that, I have noticed. But we just have to wait for this to finish setting up, and then it will push us over into the standard onboarding/configuration page. And at that point, you just simply enter all the necessary information and you're on your way to having a fully functional Home Assistant setup. So a few takeaways from this process. My BIOS was already in UEFI mode since I could use the trackpad on the laptop, which is only possible in UEFI mode, but I did have to disable secure booting. When starting from the USB stick, I pressed the escape key to force open the startup boot menu. And then from that menu, I chose to boot from the USB. Because the Wi-Fi adapter on this laptop is not supported by Home Assistant, I did have to utilize a USB to RJ45 adapter to connect to the internet. Aside from those few exceptions, this procedure was rather straightforward. And as we can see, here is the standard onboarding configuration page. You can enter in your details and get Home Assistant up and running on your laptop or any generic x86 computer. Thanks for sticking with me this far in the video. I really appreciate that. I hope you discovered something useful today, and I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. And I hope to see you in future videos. Goodbye.